Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is a Pulitzer Prize-winning American author, essayist and journalist. His work's been featured in the likes of the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, London Review of Books, plus many others, and has been translated into more than 24 languages. He also spent a decade at the International Crisis Group, the non-profit organisation working to prevent wars and shape the world in a peaceful aspect, where he led the Arab-Israeli project as director. His writing has been cited by the United Nations Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, as well as in reports by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. His latest book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, was named Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker, Time, The Economist and 15 other publications. It also won the Pulitzer Prize for General Non-Fiction this year. Nathan Thrall, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Such a pleasure to be with you.
I have been so looking forward to this interview. I read your book and it was like a veil had been lifted. Suddenly I understood what the day-to-day life was like for people living in the occupied West Bank. I don't think that I really had any real sense of it. And you have told this story in such an incredible way that I challenge anybody to walk away from it without feeling profoundly changed. And I can quite see why you won all those prizes. I'm really, really keen, though, to find out what was the making of the man that gave us this book. So tell us about your childhood.
Well, I grew up in California, and I was born to a family of Soviet emigres who came a few years before I was born. And like many Soviet Jews, they were quite secular, and they believed that they were Democrats when they arrived in the United States because the Democratic Party and many American Jews who were Democrats embraced them and were at the forefront of the cause of bringing Soviet Jews out of the Soviet Union. But they, like many Soviet Jews, became right-wing over time, and they came to see Democrats as essentially a light version of the oppression that they had faced in the Soviet Union. And they believed that Democrats were naive and were leading us to some kind of terrible communist future. And they became Republicans and Reagan supporters very quickly, and then supporters of George W. Bush and the Iraq War. And they were pro-Israel. They had considered immigrating to Israel, but my grandfather was a physicist and his career was important to him. And if he was in Israel, he'd be a taxi driver. And in the United States, he got to continue to do physics. And so I grew up in that environment in California. And it was really because a terrible accident in my own life. My grandparents got in a car crash, and my grandmother passed away. My grandfather survived. My grandparents raised me as much as my own parents. And I quit my job, and our whole family was kind of turned upside down by this event. And while I was back home dealing with all of the consequences, my mom said, you know, your grandmother had always wanted to take a trip to Israel with you. Why don't you go on one of these free birthright trips? I had never heard of birthright. Israel was not prominent on my mind in any way. And
were you a practicing Jew at that point?
So I'm not observant and have never been observant. And my family, too, strongly identify as Jewish, but they are far from observant and would characterize themselves as atheists. So I decided to go on one of these free trips to Israel, which are, of course, propagandistic in nature. They're designed to inculcate a sense of identification with Israel and lead either to the young people who go on them to immigrating to Israel or at least fighting on Israel's behalf in the countries that they come from. And it was really a result of that trip that I became interested in Israel-Palestine, and then came back and went to graduate school, came back to the United States and went to graduate school, and then moved to Israel and started working as a reporter shortly after that.
Quite an extraordinary journey. Tell me, before you got there, you'd spent some time working in the New York Review of Books.
I spent a year in Israel working as a journalist just after graduate school, and then I moved back to New York and continued to work as a journalist, and I worked on the editorial staff of the New York Review of Books. And I was begging the legendary editor of the New York Review of Books, Bob Silvers, to allow me to write for the magazine. And he would say to me, I'd bring forward a given book to write about. I grew up in California, so there was one book I remember about the penal system in California, and I asked if I could write about it. And Bob said to me, "Why would I have you write about this when I could have the best writer in the world write about it? Why wouldn't I ask Joan Didion to write about it?" And so then it took me a few months to bring up the courage to ask him again. And the next time I came to him, I had a proposal to write about something no one else was writing about, which was the U.S. training of Palestinian security forces in the West Bank. And this was something that was all the rave at the time. Everyone in the United States, Republican and Democrat, and in Europe was very enthusiastic that this was the answer to the problem in Israel-Palestine, that this would lead to a Palestinian state. It was, quote-unquote, state building from the ground up. The Palestinian security forces were working so closely with Israelis, and they were providing Israel with wonderful security, and the next thing we know, there's going to be a Palestinian state. So I asked to write about this, and specifically about the U.S. training and oversight of this program, and he agreed. And so I did about a week of reporting in the West Bank, and it really opened my eyes. It was the first time I had done reporting in the West Bank, and one of the things that was so striking to me when I was doing that reporting was somebody said to me, "We're living not under one occupation, but two." And this training of the Palestinian Authority security forces isn't going to lead to our statehood. It's just a deepening of the mechanisms of oppression over us. And so I wrote a very critical piece about this program and how actually it was just making Israel's occupation easier, and therefore that it was going to make it more long-lasting. On the basis of writing that piece, two people who write frequently in the New York Review of Books about Israel-Palestine are Hussein Agha and Rob Malley. And they both read the piece that I wrote. They really liked it. It happened to be the case that Rob Malley was the head of the Middle East program at the International Crisis Group, and he was overseeing a report that was about to come out about the same subject. And he liked the article, and he said to me, "We'd like you to do the same thing for us, for the International Crisis Group. It's essentially the same kind of writing with a lot more footnotes." And he said, "Where in the Middle East would you like to go?" And I said, "I'd like to go to Gaza." So within weeks of this article coming out, I was living in Gaza in an apartment right by the pier there, and doing my first report for the International Crisis Group, which they then liked enough to hire me full-time, and I moved to Jerusalem a few months later.
I mean, that time in Gaza must have been quite extraordinary. What are the mechanisms that allowed you to live there?
Well, one of the main mechanisms that allowed me to live there was that Crisis Group had a researcher who was a native Gazan who had incredible experience. He is cited as a producer on half of the documentaries you've seen made in Gaza. Incredible connections, incredible insight. And he became my brother. I mean, he just was with me every minute of the day. He introduced me to his family and to the society, and everything I learned, I owe to him. His name's Azmi Kashawi.
There's so much I want to talk about, but I think it's really important to get to the book. Obviously, this time at International Crisis Group gave you the tools you needed to write it, because it gave you the contacts, it gave you the feeling for the country, because your book is so deeply rooted within the West Bank and within the people that live there, but across the board. So not only do we have Palestinians living there, but we have all sorts of people who've come in from different places who are all connected by this one event. Just outline the tragedy.
The book tells the story of a school bus accident in 2012 in the greater Jerusalem area. The parents and children involved in this accident and the teachers live on the other side of the 26-foot-tall gray separation barrier known as the apartheid wall that walls off Palestinians from the center of the city. And these people are entirely encircled by walls in this community. There are two areas within it. There's the Shuafat refugee camp, and there's the town of Anata. And they're surrounded on three sides by this 26-foot-tall wall, and on the fourth side by another wall that runs through a segregated road, Route 4370, sometimes called the Apartheid Road, with Israeli traffic on one side and Palestinian traffic on the other. And these people live in condition of utter neglect. Half of them are paying municipal taxes, are officially within the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. They're receiving virtually no services. Even emergency services will refuse to enter this area unless accompanied by an army or police escort. And essentially, the police only go in this area as an occupying force. They go in with a lot of equipment and helmets and come and do a raid or demolish a home. In 2012, there was a kindergarten class in this enclave that wanted to have a special day for the kindergartners. They wanted to go to a play area. And in this enclave, there are no play areas. There are no playgrounds. There are no sidewalks. There is a single road that connects one end of it to the other, the main thoroughfare to get through this enclave. And it is so narrow that when I drive through and I'm passing a bus, I have to pull in the side mirror of my vehicle to let the bus inch past me. It's 130,000 people who are traveling on this thoroughfare, and you can imagine the kind of traffic that exists there every day. These people are burning trash in the streets because of the lack of municipal services. So there were play areas just on the other side of the wall in the Jewish settlement of Pisgat Ze'ev, an East Jerusalem settlement. But the people who live in this enclave, they have different kinds of IDs, different kinds of permission to travel through the checkpoint to get to the other side of that wall. And not all the students came from families who could go on the other side of the wall. Not all the teachers could. And so what they had to do was instead go to a distant play area to follow this winding path of the wall to the outskirts of Ramallah. And as they drove one rainy morning in February to get to this play area, they went through a checkpoint, and a minute later they were struck by a giant semi-trailer. And this semi-trailer was itself going back and forth to a settlement quarry. It was extracting natural resources, stones, from the West Bank, bringing them to a factory in the settlement industrial zone of Atarot in East Jerusalem, where those stones would be used to create concrete that would pave roads inside Israel. And the semi-trailer struck the bus flipped over, it caught fire, and it was more than half an hour before the first Israeli fire truck arrived on the scene.
And yet this is a minute from a checkpoint.
A minute from a checkpoint. Some of the bystanders ran down to the checkpoint, begged the soldiers to come and help. They refused. Some of them reported that the soldiers appeared scared. This is a road used entirely by Palestinians. And it should be said also, this is a bit of a detour, the main purpose of this checkpoint is actually to ease traffic for settlers. Because as soon as you go through this checkpoint, you merge with a road that's used by both Palestinians and settlers. And the checkpoint was only manned at rush hour, in the morning and in the afternoon. The only purpose of manning a checkpoint, of staffing a checkpoint, only at rush hour is just to ease traffic for the settlers, so that all the Palestinians are lined up and sitting there while settlers are going to and from their jobs, from their homes to their jobs and back. So the people on this road, because it is used almost entirely by Palestinians, pulled over on the side of the road, got out of their cars, and tried desperately to help. But they, had tiny little fire extinguishers in the back, in the trunks of their cars. They were, using them to little effect on this raging fire. One brave man who lived close to the accident site, together with one of the teachers, heroically entered this burning bus and pulled out dozens of children. And when the children, covered in soot, are carried off of the bus, they're put in the back seat of just private cars of the people who had pulled over. And those people themselves, like the people in Anata, have different color IDs. Some of them have the right color ID to go through the checkpoint and access the superior hospitals that are very nearby in Jerusalem. Some of them don't. So the kids are being transported in different directions by different drivers. And I tell the story of one particular father named Abed Salama, who learned of the crash, rushed to the scene of the accident, gets out of the car that's taking him in traffic and starts running toward the accident site, hails an army jeep, tells them that his son is involved in an accident up the road. They refuse to give him a ride. He sprints toward the accident site. There's a huge crowd of people and a burned out shell of a bus and no children. And he starts to ask the people in the crowd, where are the children? And they tell him many different answers. They say they're at one hospital in East Jerusalem, they're at another hospital in West Jerusalem, they're at the military base a minute up the road, they're at the Ramallah hospital. Abed himself has a green West Bank ID. He cannot access most of these places. He can't access the military base. He cannot access any of the Jerusalem hospitals, east or west. So he goes to the one place he can go, which is the hospital in Ramallah. He calls on relatives who do have the right color ID to go through the checkpoints, to go look for his son at these different hospitals. And over a day later, he finally finds out what has happened to his son. He can't even locate his son. And really, it's through his story and the stories of other emergency service providers, both Jewish and Palestinian, the founder of the settlement next to where the accident took place, that we learn the entire story of Israel-Palestine.
And the way you do it is absolutely brilliant, because you don't tell the story chronologically. We know that this is all taking place over this sort of frantic 24 hours while he's trying to find his kid. But we go into his background, we go into the backgrounds of so many other people, this huge kind of varying cast of characters. One thing that made a really, really huge impression on me is you talk about the place where he lived, Anata, as an 18th century pre-industrial village. And you also talk about the various cultural forces that drive relationships, particularly between men and women and between clans, and how revenge and honour are such big, big issues within that. And I felt that we see that being writ large within this whole crisis.
Yes, absolutely. This book, its chief aim was to put you inside the shoes of Abed and the other characters. And it was incredibly important for me to show the entire society, the entire world that he inhabits. And so much of it is rivalry within his community. It's people who are collaborating with the Israelis, others who are opposed to collaboration. The story is filled with jealousy and with honor and with betrayal. And if these people were not three-dimensional human beings, it would be very hard to identify with them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so many different characters, as I said, but there is, for instance, one woman who has had a terrible time years earlier and is still haunted by the body parts she had to pick up, and now is involved in this. Tell us a little about her.
Her name is Huda Dahbour, and she is a doctor who works for the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, and she runs a mobile medical clinic. And on the morning of the crash, she was heading with her team to one of the sites where they treat Palestinians who are in need of care, who are living in the part of the West Bank under full Israeli control. And she came upon this burning bus and instructed the driver to pull over. And she got out with some of the other staff. One of her staff members was pregnant and was traumatized by what she saw, and they had to bring her back into the van and just lock her in there. And, you know, Huda is somebody who embodies the story of Palestinian exile. Her family came from Haifa. They had Jewish neighbors. And one day they were forced out of Haifa, like most of the Palestinian population there. And Huda grew up in a refugee camp in Syria and heard stories about Haifa, dreamed of returning to Haifa. She eventually became a doctor and married a Palestinian diplomat. And because of that marriage, and because in the very early period of Oslo, Israel let a select number of PLO officials to return not to homes that they may have come from, but to return to the occupied territories, Huda was able to step foot in Palestine for the first time. And it was a striking experience for her, because it didn't feel like return. She wasn't actually returning to Haifa, and she had very mixed feelings about a place that she had romanticized and that she had heard stories about growing up. And now she faced the challenge of raising children under occupation. And she lived in terror that her son, who was being harassed by the Israeli army outside his school, was going to start joining the other students who would throw stones after school at the occupying army, and that he would be taken from her. And that was exactly what happened. The army came after 1 a.m. one night, banged loudly on the door. She opened it, asked them what they wanted. They said they wanted her son. She said, "Tell me what he's done." They refused to tell her. And she led them up to her son's bedroom, and she wanted to give her son a hug before he's going to be carried off by this frightening armed force. And she was afraid to do it. She knew that any gesture like that, she could be shot, he could be shot. And she herself spent a week just trying to locate him, what detention facility he was held in. And because she worked for UNRWA, she had much more freedom of movement than other Palestinians, so she could make that search. And she finally shows up at his trial and sees that he's been tortured, and she yells for him to lift up his shirt and show the marks of abuse that he received from the Israeli soldiers. She describes as being the worst year and a half of her life, this period of her son's detention. And this is the experience of every family in the West Bank.
So many other characters that there are the ultra-Orthodox Jewish volunteers who attend attack sites to ensure respect for the dead. There is a Moroccan-born settler, who comes out with his neighbours to make a banner saying how sorry they are about the accident. All of these things are going on, and people have to read the book to really get into it. I wanted, though, to ask you a couple of other questions about what's going on now and about where thought processes are going with this, because if one reads an outlet like Haaretz, for instance, now that is seen by us here in Britain as being quite liberal. They're anti-occupation. How would you characterise Haaretz and other organisations who are anti-Zionist?
I would definitely say that Haaretz is a Zionist newspaper. It is a left Zionist newspaper, but it is definitely a Zionist newspaper. And the fundamental issue about separating a kind of Zionist from an anti-Zionist, there are a number of different ways that one could approach that question. There's a historical way, there's a present-day way. But the most simple way of putting it is this. Inside Israel proper, Israel within its pre-1967 boundaries, about 20% of the citizens of Israel are Palestinian. They're Palestinians who were among the minority that were not expelled or forced to flee from what is present-day Israel in 1948. They remained behind. And a large number of these Palestinian citizens would like Israel. I'm ignoring now the occupied territories. I'm ignoring the West Bank and Gaza. Let's imagine that there's a Palestinian state that exists. They're saying just within Israel, within its pre-1967 boundaries, we would like this to be a normal democracy, what they call a state of all its citizens, meaning no discrimination among citizens based on their ethnicity or their religion. Now, that is considered an anti-Zionist position because it would mean that Israel is no longer a Jewish state. Even though there's a Jewish majority in the state, we're talking about a huge Jewish majority, not including, of course, the occupied territories. If we include all the Palestinians under Israeli control, Jews are a minority. But that itself is an anti-Zionist position, the simple call for equality within Israel itself. And that characterizes 99% of Israeli Jews. They do not want full equality for Jews and Palestinians, even within Israel proper.
What does your mother think?
She has withheld her views from me for a number of years because she's let me know that it's too painful for her to read what I write, that she can't read what I write. And she continues to be very right-wing, very pro-Israel, and just deeply pained that, her son is, in her view, a traitor to the things she cares about almost more than anything else.
What is your relationship now with the people in the book, and how easily are you able to see them in the occupied territory?
I have a very close relationship with Abed in particular. I just spoke to him this morning. I see him every couple of weeks. And he has, like most Palestinians in the West Bank, been living in awful circumstances since October 7th. The restrictions on movement for Palestinians in the West Bank are as great as they have ever been. It now takes hours to travel distances that took a half hour just a year ago. We have over 600 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th in the West Bank, some of them Abed's relatives. And economically, everybody is suffering. The biggest employment sector for Palestinians are jobs inside Israel and the settlements. And, more than 100,000 of those jobs have disappeared since October 7th. So people are feeling constricted in terms of their movement. They're feeling choked economically. They're being killed. They feel the roads are not safe because of settler violence and violence from the army. And the level of forced displacement, more than 1,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced in the West Bank in just the 6 weeks after October 7th. While the whole world was paying attention to Gaza, the settlement project has been advancing at a rapid pace inside the West Bank, and it is advancing at a rapid pace now. So Abed's situation is quite precarious.
Has he read the book?
He has read the book. He was the first person to read the book. And he's very, very happy about the fact that, as he puts it, his son, Milad, the name of Milad is on the tongue of people all over the world. It's something that's a great comfort to him.
Nathan Thrall, thank you. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for coming in to talk to us.
It's been a pleasure.
A Day in the Life of Abed Salama is published by Penguin. The paperback edition is out now. It is by Nathan Thrall. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the producer Steph Chungu, who also edited the show. You can download this programme and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.